Cool. You guys hear me? My clock says 3:50. I have a lot of slides to go through, so I'm just going to jump in. I anticipate a lot of people still walking in, but I apologize if you miss anything good. So I'm going to start with a brief story just to get going. 4 full-stack engineers walk into a small cage and are told to write a new app. High up on top of the cage, well beyond their reach, is a brand new technology called bananas. Underneath these bananas is a well-documented ladder. The engineers immediately spot these bananas, and one begins to climb the ladder. As they do, an instigator sprays him with a stream of cold water and questions him about why these bananas would never work. Then the instigator proceeds to spray each and every one of the other engineers. The engineer on the ladder scrambles off, and all 4 sit at a time on the floor, wet, cold, and bewildered. Soon, though, the temptation of the bananas is too great, and another engineer begins to climb the ladder. Again, the instigator sprays the ambitious engineer with cold water, and all the other engineers as well. When a third engineer tries to climb the ladder, the other engineers, wanting to avoid the cold spray, pull him off the ladder and beat him. Frustrated with the limitations of the cold water, one engineer leaves to work for a new startup, and a new engineer is introduced to the cage. I distinct that with a blue mustache. That's a new engineer. Spotting the bananas, the naive engineer begins to climb the ladder, and the other engineers pull him off and beat him. Here's what gets interesting. The incident gets another one of the engineers to leave and replaces him with a new engineer. Again, the new engineer begins to climb the ladder, and again, the other engineers pull them off and beat them, including the new engineer who has never been sprayed. By the end of the experiment, none of the engineers who were there in the beginning were left, and despite none of them experienced the cold, wet, and spray, they learned never to try to go for the bananas again. The metaphor and the lessons that apply here are clear. Despite the original limitations in the cage being solved or fixed, cold water is poured on the people and their ideas whenever they try to do something new. So I'm actually going to talk about ReactNative. I'm just trying to, a little icebreaker. ReactNative is something, I did that little that intro because React in general, I always poo-pooed about. I started as a Rails developer. I got into Ember, and I thought I had it all. But then ReactNative changed that for me, and that's what this talk's going to be all about. So if you don't mind, bear with me. I'm going to make another metaphor to ReactNative rather. ReactNative is kind of like Kanye. He's dropping new beats, new hits all the time. And at first you don't like them, but eventually you start to like them. And I guess the gift didn't really matter. But who'd have thought Kanye would have spoke so much truth about what I'm about to talk about? So this is my opening slide. It's going to be about React Native, and it's going to be, should I even bother to learn Swift? That's a question I had when I first got into React Native, and I answered it. So I'm going to answer it for you guys today. But before I do that, we're going to go back to the future, or back to the past, per se, actually. Back to 2009, where the introduction of Node. During this time, Lady Gaga was actually pulling out hits faster than JavaScript frameworks could be built, which was true because we didn't have that many JavaScript frameworks then. So Node was interesting. It was introduced. Node, at that time, there were engineers that did the front end and that knew JavaScript. At that time, if you did JavaScript, people felt bad for you. There was a lot of limitations in JavaScript, and Node kind of opened up the front end to the back end. So you could do Node server code, and you could also do front end JavaScript code. So you could say that the lines between front end and back end JavaScript got blurred. So let's travel back in time, but not actually forward in time a little, not too far, 2014. The introduction of Swift. Swift was announced then. Not a lot of people in the iOS community knew Swift was coming. It was basically Swift is what's good about Objective-C, which is nothing, and what's good and what's great about all the dynamic and scripting languages. So Swift kind of fell in the laps of iOS developers. You could say it came in like a wrecking ball. That's the cleanest Miley Cyrus picture I could get on the internet. So there you go. So the line between iOS was blurred now, but not really. From an outsider looking in, Swift is a very nice. It's a very nice syntax. It's very approachable, but unfortunately, with iOS, you still have to learn all these other things. I won't go through the list, but I mean, it's a lot of legacy things you've got to implement into your Swift code. Plus the fact that Objective-C still reigns supreme at the moment. So I came to this conclusion that iOS is still hard. I actually attempted Swift about over a year ago and pretty much bailed on it, walked away from that, and didn't do any mobile development after that until very recently. But I just want to talk about React Native again. So React Native came out in 2015, which is March of 2015, which is less than a year ago. So React Native is still very new. There's a lot of things that are new about it and exciting about it, but I'll get into that later. So back to my Kanye example. At one point, Swift seemed like the way to do everything. But then Kanye came along and told Swift there was something better out there. So let's move away from that slide. So everything, basically, if you want to understand React is everything's in a component. That's the gist of it. Some of the problems I get with like blog posts from React and even React Native in general is that they try to get too much into the weeds about how React works, when in reality, React is actually pretty simple. So I'm not going to get in the weeds today, but I'm going to talk about components today. This is, but this forewarning, everything that I'm going to talk about is going to be in ES6 or ES 2016, well, ES6 now, because 2016 is not going to include some of this stuff, but which I found out in the first talk on the panel. But anyway, so this is a JavaScript class. This is an ES6, ES6 class. I'm using a React component. I'm not going to go line by line yet, but just know that this is a component in an ES6 class for the sake of this talk. So basically, I'm going to break it down line by line now. What you have here is props. So props are like things that you can pass in the components, and that's the super simple way to do that right there. And let me just reset that too. And then also know that there's a nested component inside of this component. So that's also possible. So again, you could have components on top of components, and all the code lives separately inside of each component. So I'm not going to go too much more in detail for that, but just know that that's how it works. And also note that there's a navigator prop in this notes prop, or this notes component. That's also happening. So I'll get more in detail on that later. And just reset again. And also, something also to keep, another point of contention for React and React Native is JSX. JSX is inline CSS and HTML. This is a big reason why I didn't like React when I first saw it. I had a lot of scar tissue from CoffeeScript, so I wanted to keep all the logic of JavaScript separate and make it JavaScript. But once I got into JSX, it made sense. I had very little, by this point in time, I had very little Objective-C and Swift experience. And actually, before I get into that, let me just show you JSX. It's this inline style. So that's a variable that I'm defining my styles. Another thing you want to note is Flexbox it's like a first-class citizen in your CSS or your JSX. So they use that all throughout. It helps a lot, too. It's like next-level CSS if you're not familiar with it. And then again, this is my view component, and you can see I have a style prop, and it's got my styles injected inline. So it's like 1999 all over again. And then I kind of separated that to let you know. So that's JSX. Now this is Swift. Swift is again, I don't know all the best practices for Swift and Objective-C, but when I did Swift and Objective-C, all my styles are inline as well. So that's why I said JSX kind of makes sense. I'm not going to break this line by line, but you can see like the RGB, and I'm like defining a color. At line 121, it might be small print to actually look at the lines, but just note that Swift is pretty much similar as far as inline styles. Again, I'm just going to, sorry, I didn't preface. I'm just going to start explaining some other things about React. So, sorry, React Native, sorry. If I say React, just know that that's not synonymous with React Native. I'm not going to specifically talk about React today. So yeah, React Native, you have views and not divs. That's one thing I had to figure out. I didn't understand why I couldn't put a div inside of my class. But just understand that the logic is all built to use views. Views are very similar to table views in iOS. So a lot of that knowledge transfers over. But it's more of a watered-down table view. Table views in iOS have a lot of like extra API calls and stuff like that. So, which I'll get into later of how I had a workaround for that. So I'm going to just reset again. So that's basically my main component. This is my Node app, which I will explain if it wasn't a giveaway by the notes component. This is the app that I built using React Native. It's just very generic notes. I'm using Firebase to save the data. Using no Flux, I'm not going to get into Flux. It's a little out of scope for the talk today. But yeah, that's just me writing a note. about Elmo. All right, so what about Swift? Well, before I get into Swift, I'm actually going to talk about something I really like talking about a lot, and that's me. So my name is Brian Douglas. I go by bdougie on GitHub. All the code that I showed is going to be on GitHub, so if you feel like you want to dig deep, if I missed something, feel free to go there. And yes, there is a popular song named after me. If you're at the after party, I might give you a free lesson. Who knows? Depends on how many drinks I got. So, oh, and this is what I look like on the internet. That's my Twitter handle. And just moving right along, I work for a company called Block. Block is an online mentorship program. It's a boot camp per se, but rather than a classroom setting, you get a mentor matched to you, one-on-one, and you go to a curriculum. I mention this because I'm not only a current employee, I'm an alum of Block, and I'm also a current student of Block. Block gives us the opportunity to pick a course of our choice and go through it with a mentor. And the course I chose, obviously, was iOS. So for the past 36 weeks, I started learning iOS. The Block curriculum has a curriculum that you start off with where you get Objective-C Foundation. So in that foundation, I learned how to build a calculator, I learned how to build a web browser, and then I also built a Instagram clone, which is named Blockstagram for obvious reasons. During the second half of the course, you get out of the curriculum and you get a list of features. It's called a project phase. So rather than using a curriculum to actually learn, you're just getting a list of features and you just use Google or iOS documentation to actually build a project. So the project I made, as my first project, I used Swift. For the main reason, I was more interested in Swift than Objective-C at that time. I tried it before and just gave it up. And also my mentor that I was paired with, this guy out in New York, he had been using Swift since its inception, so he had a lot of knowledge from like 0 dot whatever to current Swift. So I was able to leverage that, and that's one thing that I like about Block is I can leverage my mentor for knowledge outside of a curriculum, which most of our curriculum is Objective-C at this point. So I made a messenger app for Kanye. It's an app. It's super buggy. It's not live. You can't ever see it, but you can look at the source code. It's a Swift app, and it just basically sends messages, quotes from the internet that Kanye said, like really stupid stuff. And I built it all in Swift, and I was able to learn a lot of Swift at the time, and I got pretty competent in Swift. So at that time, my mentor, I knew web, because I didn't mention, I'm actually a full-stack web developer, so I do JavaScript, Angular, Rails, what have you, a little bit of React now. And so I knew web, and I knew iOS. So at that point, the lines between iOS and web became blurred. So my mentor approached me in one of our meetings. He said, well, you know JavaScript, right? Why don't you try React Native for your next project? So I said, why not? So I did it. Just a little aside, I just wanted to put JavaScript and Swift next to each other. I know it's cut off a little bit at the bottom, but I just wanted to look at if you could just do like the squint test, Swift and JavaScript, and this is ES6, looks very similar. If you know JavaScript, you could pretty much do Swift outside of some iOS library stuff you might have to look into. But just know that Swift is not that hard to grasp. So I just wanted to let you guys know that. So now I'm going to talk about React Native, and I'm going to take a sip real quick. So React Native is something that came out last March. It enables JavaScript developers to write iOS code, native code. Around in iOS 7 or Mavericks is like the comparable of what came out that year. In Xcode, JavaScript, this thing called JavaScript Core came out, where it enables you to write actual JavaScript in Xcode. So it's a wrapper over WebKit. So you can have interaction with things like web views and stuff like that you can do with JavaScript Core. I won't get too much in the weeds about that, but just note that React Native is all compiles to Objective-C and JavaScript Core. So getting started is actually super easy. With just doing those 2 lines that I have in the blue box, that's just taken right off the Facebook docs. You can get started with React Native. It might take a while, so you might have to let it ride for a little bit. But just note that you're going to need Node 4.0 anything 4 or later. for this to actually work. I had to figure out the hard way. It took me 30 minutes to figure it out because I'm not one to actually read the documentation. I just kind of just jump in and do it. So I had to go back to the documentation and figure that out. And yeah, so that one's for free for you guys. You guys just take a note of that. So this is the app you're actually going to get. It's a generic, like welcome to React. It's very similar to frameworks. They give you some static hello world. This is nice because to get up and running, I have a little GIF. So as soon as I install that, I've got React Native. There's something that's really cool is you got a hot loader. So as soon as once I enable it, I can change text, and it will load. I refreshed. I messed up. Yeah. So once I hit save, boom. All right. So you got a hot reloaded. Has anybody? I didn't ask. Has anybody used React Native in the room? Cool. Not a lot, but some. Does anybody use? Yeah, I'll just ask that. So React Native is pretty awesome. Oh, sorry. I was going to ask. Does anybody do iOS here? Ever done iOS? So when you update code in iOS, you got to restart the simulator, and that's pretty painful, especially if you have a large app, if you got a lot of stuff going, or if you're just trying to iterate fast. It takes so much time to continue to hit restart on the simulator. Sometimes it could be slow, sometimes it could be fast, but most of the time it's slow. That is huge for me. So to do simple things like copy changes and color changes and stuff like that, that's really nice. Also, not pictured is you can debug in the Chrome console, which if I wasn't familiar with Xcode and debugging, I hate it. I hate it a lot. It's really hard if you're not familiar with it. It's painful. But I knew JavaScript and I knew Chrome, so that made it a lot easier. So just note that happens even though it's not picture. So now I'm going to get into my actual project. I did show some of the code previously. It was the same code. But this is now I'm going to get in the more of the weeds of the project. But I just want to preface that this project, it's called Block Notes. It's just a simple Node app. What's nice about using the project as my basis of React Native is I had a clear list of features to obtain, so I could prototype this and figure out is React Native even worth using. If I came up with any roadblocks, which I didn't come up with too many of them, then I could just figure out if React Native was pretty viable. So basic things is creating notes, setting a title. These are all checkpoints within the project, our features that you had to do. Sharing notes, searching notes, and detectable links, which is something I'm not going to go to, but it's like when you send a text message and you can click the link, or it opens the phone or the Safari and stuff like that. So I had to do that. So this is my notes component. If you're not familiar with React, actually, who knows React in here? Okay, a lot of you. Good, cool. So I don't know how to explain this. I'm just pulling out using destructuring, I'm pulling out different modules out of the React Native API. And I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but I'm just going to show how it kind of works with React, sort of line by line. So I'm going to talk about Vue first. So this is my wall of text of code, which, oh, cool. Most of it's there. And so this is my Vue. Within the render function within the class, there's a return function that returns that specific view. That's a common practice with React and React Native. That's my view. Again, it's like table views. I have my styles on there. Not really much to talk about. Now, list views is pretty cool. It's just very similar to, I just went blank on what it was called in iOS, but just know that there's a comparable thing in iOS that's similar to list view. And yeah, so I'm just pulling that out. List view is basically each note that I have there, list view is going to render a separate item. So it's almost like using map. Actually, it's just like using map. And that's what that is. So I'm going to break that down now. With list view, there's going to be, in the API, there's going to be two different props. One's going to be the data source, and the other one's going to be the render row, and that's what's doing that's similar to the map thing. Let me talk about data source first. Data source is literally what it is. It's the data that you're going to pass into your list view. So it's built like an array, and you're able to iterate over that and present that in using render row. One thing to note that there's a state, this.ds, that I'm passing in all my list data. So I believe it's just straight from the API documentation. You could change that to this.stuff, and it will still work. But just note that that's why I called it DS. Anyway. So there's my data source being set. So I have a fetch method. I deleted a lot of code. There's a lot more code in there, but I just put this fetch method just to know that you're inside the class at that point. I have a fetch method that's calling to Firebase and with my API module. And right there, I'm setting the state, which is data source at the moment, and that's how that happens. No real question to that. And then I also wanted to note that clone with rows is also happening there, so that's what's actually taking each object in that array and setting it to the list view. So now I have these rows all set up for me. So now I'm going to talk about render row, which is pretty self-explanatory. Again, this is, if you're familiar with React Native or React, this is going to sound like, oh, why are you talking about this? Most likely because there's a lot of people who haven't seen this, but it's pretty straightforward. I mean, there's no like magic to it. And then I'm rendering my rows. Sorry, I think I have this slide twice. All right, so I just wanted to note too, also, I'm going to talk about touchable highlight. Touchable highlight is a wrapper outside of whatever you're rendering. So again, going back to the notes, every time you want to touch a note and do something, you use that onPress prop, and you can pass in a function. My function's called viewNote, so I can view a note. And this is that happening. So now I'm like going in and out of notes, touching them, view notes getting called, and we're good to go. Hopefully that makes sense. Nice. So at this point, once I figured this out, this was like 1 weekend of work to get my notes rendered and working. I don't know if that's out of the norm or whatever, but I pretty much knew, I didn't know what I was doing, but I figured it out rather quickly. I think that weekend I probably put maybe close to 8 hours on a project, because I only worked on my projects on the weekends. So yeah, I felt pretty good about this. Some things that I'm not going to talk about is testing and swiping detectable links. I have a blog that goes in more detail about that, but I felt for the sake of time not to go in there. So just make a note, it's my name.me and a blog in front of it. I'll stop for pictures. But I could literally go on like slide by slide about things I figured out in React Native. But I won't do that because you guys have stuff to do today. So back to this question. Remember this question? Should I use Swift? You could do stuff in React Native. Should I use Swift? Well, I'm going to answer that now. So there's a thing that I had to do. It's called note sharing. So can you see it? OK. So there's like that little share icon, which I have here. I knew it was going to get cut off, so I put it up there. I cut it out and put it there. I had to, oh, you can't see, but I hit the button, and now I'm going to add my Black Notes extension so I can share this website to my notes. And I believe I'll save it. And once I figure out how to click home, there's my shared note right there. Cool. So this is something that I had to do outside of React Native. React Native doesn't really cover this in the API documentation. React Native, that core team, they basically said they're not going to cover every single iOS feature in React Native. They might get there if it's around long enough, but there's things like sharing to your app, I had to do in Swift. I created this thing called a node extension. Well, it's called an extension in iOS. I think I called it a node extension as my file. No, I didn't. Anyway, so I had to create a share view controller, which does all this Swift code to be able to share to Firebase. So I kind of circumvented my React Native app in order to get this accomplished, because I felt like, why would you do all that work and then go shove it back to React Native and then save it to my Firebase, which is completely separate anyway. So for this, that's what I did here. Again, I'm not going to go line by line in the Swift side, but just know that this works. And so the reverse of that, so when I'm in my app and I want to share to something else, that I was able to do in React Native. So I basically, and I'll just show this working. I have a little share button up here, which then pulls up the sharing functions. I only enabled copying just for the sake of my app, just to get it to work. I guess I could have did more, but. And now in the memory, I'm able to, once I figure out how to paste paste, and there you go. I've copied stuff. So that was a proof of concept to show that it works. I had to go into iOS again to get this started. So when I'm starting in, actually I'm starting in my app. But anyway, I created a share manager. React Native has this thing called React Native modules, native modules, where you could actually write code in Objective-C or vice versa and talk back and forth. The documentation is pretty extensive on that. It's like one of the few places that actually have clear documentation. Not a knock at React Native, but there's just a lot of limitations in the documentation. But yeah, so I'm creating this. This is actually in Objective-C, by the way. I'm creating this export, I'm saving stuff, I'm sending it back, and I'm actually passing it to my share module. Again, iOS stuff, I'm not going to go line by line. I just assume maybe people weren't as familiar with Objective-C as Swift. I actually chose Objective-C for the reason of the limitation of Swift. At the moment, Swift, you can't export stuff out of Swift and anywhere else, but you can only do it in Objective-C, which would then, it's going to get in the weeds a little bit, then would require me to write in Swift, export it in a kind of like a, sorry, I don't have this in my notes, but I had to export it into an Objective-C helper class, a .h file, and then send it back to this file, and then export it to React Native. So I was like, why am I going to do that? I already know how to do it in this. So for the sake of this talk, yes, I did do Objective-C, and I had to know a little bit of Objective-C. Not really. A blog post told me exactly what to write, so I just copied and pasted and put in my variables. So going back to React Native, I'm actually including the React Native native modules, and Share Manager I'm including. Share Manager is what I named it. And I'm able to have a share function, and I'm able to share stuff. So I can put it into my Objective-C class and then do whatever I need to do with it. So if I wanted to share it to, let's say, Mail or Safari or whatever, I could do that. I just didn't want to write that much Objective-C. So that's the gist of my app. So there's like a lot of things that I haven't touched, a lot of things I haven't figured out in React Native. There's actually 5 issues that I had on this list originally. Now I only have 1 because React Native actually closed them all. They figured them out, and they're basically good to go. The team moves pretty fast on things that are problems, but they're also not that big of a team, too. So some things take real short amount of time, some things are quick. But I just wanted to note that there's still some problems with React Native. And mainly, you could sum up this slide with how young React Native is. Again, we're less than a year out. So there's going to be some edge cases that you can't accomplish. So back to my original slide, React Native versus Swift. What do I do? Well, I think if you're going to ask that question, you're asking the wrong question. Because the answer is React Native and Swift. What's nice about React Native is you're going to learn Swift. If you want to learn Swift, you don't have to learn Swift. You're going to learn Objective-C, and you're going to learn to solve problems. React Native is actually really good at getting out of the way for you. So when you hit a limitation in React Native, you can easily make a native module and start writing a little bit of Swift code to make that work. That's really nice about React Native, and that's, again, the JavaScript core engine helps you do that, because you can just pass code back and forth. Also, React Native helps you do that with that share native module stuff. So what's so great about React Native? If you didn't get it already, React Native is great with fast prototyping. You can write in JavaScript, which is nice. So coming from the web and not knowing Objective-C or Swift, it's really nice to get like 1 weekend out of the way and just learn a little bit of React Native, and you're good to go. You could also use a lot of different tools in JavaScript, too. I didn't go through all those, but just know you can do that. As I close, I wanted to mention that Discover VR is an app. It's built all in React Native. Is anybody familiar with Discover VR? Ever used it? Well, if you haven't used it, they were the host of the Puppy Bowl 2016. This was created by a consultancy in Nashville. It's called Chalk and Chisel. And they were mainly an iOS shop. Not for the most part, they were native iOS. And one of their engineers, Mark Schilling, actually wrote a really good blog post. I highly recommend just Googling that or looking on Medium. Either Mark Schilling, Chalk and Chisel, or that title. You'll figure it out. And he wrote a really good perspective based on working with Discovery VR, coming as an iOS developer, and some of the limitations. But he came away thinking that React Native isn't a sidestep outside of iOS, but it's a really good way to think. So they came up with the conclusion. At the very end, he has this quote, "Step outside of your comfort zone, and you may find something even better than before." So he was able to, I don't think they're going to write every single iOS app at that shop using React Native, but I think they're going to make a really good case, either why or why not for React Native. And it makes sense. He actually, I think, one of the engineers, actually his boss, did a talk in November and went more in detail about this, but I think he was actually one of the only iOS engineers at the company. So there was a big limitation to get things done because they had to wait on him. So now they have a React Native app. They're able to enable the rest of the developers that are working on the API and some of the jQuery and stuff like that for the website to be able to get knee-deep in the React code and just kind of get stuff done. They'll probably fumble at first, but I think they'll figure it out. Something else that I didn't bring up was Android. Android, at the time I was learning React Native, Android became like legit in React Native. So I didn't have time for the sake of this conference and for the sake of my iOS course to do Android. But just note that this project, React Native MBA app, is side by side. I think on the left is iOS and the right's Android. These guys accomplish what everybody has questions about. Can I write code and React Native and be good to go? React Native's did I say that slide twice? Anyway, so React Native's motto is to learn once, write everywhere. So there's some things that you're going to write in iOS that you can't write in Android, but just keep that in mind. I think Chalk and Chisel, they mentioned that when they ported Discover VR over, they were able to port 80% of their code over to Android, and they just had to rewrite 20% of it. Egghead.io, Tyler McGinnis actually was in one of the panels. He's actually here today. And his React Native intro is probably hands down the best intro. I did that prior to that weekend that I did this Node app. I went through that. I actually went through like 5 tutorials before doing this. But I don't think you really need to do 5. I think you just need to do his. So just check out egghead.io. Cool. Well, that's my Twitter handle. And I have a few minutes to answer questions if you guys have it. I went fast through a lot of things, so I'm sure there's some things I didn't cover. Does anybody have any questions? In the back, if you speak loud.
Yeah, have you tried this on tvOS or WatchOS?
I have not. I know tvOS, I don't think it's there yet for React Native. There's this tvOS, it's built. I haven't tried anything in tvOS, but when it came out, I read the documentation, and it's different than even Watch or iWatch. So I don't think you're going to get a lot of stuff done if you use React Native at this point today.
Is it possible to
Yeah, it's very, like, with using ES6 and classes and components, like I said, Chalk and Chisel, 80% of their app is agnostic between framework. My API to talk to Firebase is pretty agnostic. So I'm able to put that in a lib folder and just, include it, import it, or if you want to use common.js, you can use require. So yeah.
Would you use like an interface that's implemented on both Android and iOS or something like that?
So with React Native, I probably should have went through this, but it's a good question. You're going to have an index.ios.js file, and you're going to have an android.ios.js file. And those live all the way in the top level of your file structure. So then you could have your app folder, and you could include stuff from that. So it does live separate. You have 2 indexes. One talks to Objective-C, and one talks to whatever Android uses at this point. Yeah. So that's a good question. I didn't cover in the scope of this talk, but I'm going to answer it real quick. But Chalk and Chisel, again, their November talk goes right into how you send apps to production. But just to note, for React Native, you can actually export it all to Objective-C. That's what actually is what's happening. So when you actually compile down and get ready for the App Store, Apple's not seeing JavaScript. They might see a little bit of JavaScript talking to the web if that's what you did. But all of it's going to compile down in Objective-C. So when they get their app to review in like 2 to 6 months or whatever, how long it takes them to review an app, they're just going to see Objective-C code. And their QA department's actually mainly not looking at your code. It's just looking at how buggy it is. So if you got like glaring holes in your code, you'll probably get kicked back on that. But for the most part, they don't know if you're doing React Native unless they know some of that. I'm not going to show it, but in Xcode rather, all the React files are prefaced with RN. So I'm sure some people might look at your code and be like, oh, this guy did React Native. But if it works, they'll approve it. It's the same thing with Cordova, and the same thing with all those other, hybrid things. Question in the back? Yeah. Yeah, as long as if your app works, you're good. Yeah, and going back to my blog, I talk about how to get your app ready for production, how to compile it down, how to test it on your phone. Yeah, I go into a blog post about that. It's pretty simple. You just kind of change a couple lines in the code, and you're good to go. Probably oversimplified that, but just know it works. In the back on the right? Yeah. Yes. Yep, when it compiles down, yeah, you can edit it. I haven't myself because I don't know, I just never felt like I needed to. But yeah, just know that you can dig deep if you really want to. In the middle, I keep missing you. Yeah, actually, yes. It's huge. In iOS, it's way different. So I didn't mention, but core data is completely different. It's ORM on top of SQL. And like I haven't really dug deep in core data. But yeah, it's completely different to like, let's say Flux, or rather Redux. I think Redux is kind of like the way everybody's going. Redux works well with React Native. But yeah, coming from like web and JavaScript, it's different than Swift. There's different best practices. You can kind of force your Swift code into like more of like a JavaScript way of thinking. That's totally possible. But it goes against like the best practices of some of the things that iOS do. But yeah, there are differences, but yeah, you could, if you really wanted to like, I want to write my code one way, the same way every time, then yeah, you could totally do that. One of the biggest pitfalls, I think, for newer iOS developers, which I fell into, is shoving tons of stuff in your controller. I think that's pretty common for a lot of languages and frameworks. I did that, and it was a big problem, and I was able to refactor out stuff, so I can have like this stuff that talks to data, stuff like different modules. There's also a big learning curve because it's like, I think iOS, it's not MVC, it's like MVVC, and there's like different like view models and stuff like that like talk to the view and the controller, and yeah, that's in the weeds, but just note that it's slightly different as far as best practices. One more question on the left, first one. Yeah, it's totally possible. The React Native podcast or React Native radio, whatever, they had a good episode like maybe a couple months ago about that, doing hybrid applications and maybe thinking iOS first. But yeah, it's totally possible. I think it might be difficult because with the React Native CLI, the two commands I showed you in getting started, it sets you up to start your React app first. So you're going to have to figure out how to get all that React Native code into your established iOS app. But if you wanted to start off with React Native off the bat and then override all that with Swift, I mean, it's all Xcode at this point. But you're going to have to know Objective-C at that point to get around stuff. One more question, just for the fun of it. Performance concerns? No, but again, Chalk and Chisel, I keep going back to them. I literally just watched his talk like Monday, and I was like, oh, this guy, they said so many good things. They had an issue going back to where React Native stops, and then you can take Xcode or iOS to do the rest. They had an issue where they were rendering. So with Discover VR, you could pick like what videos you want to watch, and it's like supposed to be virtual reality, and you have like the Google Cardboard, and you walk around with it. The actual viewing of the actual VR is done in Swift, and that's because they had performance limitations trying to send it from JavaScript to iOS. So it made no sense at that point, so they just overrid that and did it all in Objective-C, actually, is what they wrote their app in. So yeah. Hey, that's my Twitter handle. I'll be walking around. If you guys have any more questions or if you just want to be friends, come find me. Thank you.